homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. Today I am making a recipe from this very old cookbook. This is a 1925-1926 Bozeman Women's Club cookbook that belonged to my great-grandmother and then my grandmother. And they were from Utah and Idaho, so I'm not really sure how a Bozeman cookbook ended up in their hands. But I've started a social media group on Facebook and also on Instagram where I'm just doing a page a day of this in terms of photographing them, just because it's really fun to look at old recipes. And every once in a while there's one that intrigues me enough that I'm like, I think I might want to make that. And so the recipe that I'm thinking of making today is called Sweet Potato Pone, P-O-N-E. It's on page 20. And evidently in the colonial times, pone was really common, but it was corn pone, not necessarily sweet potato pone. And corn pone was served for breakfast, so it was a really common breakfast. And from what I can tell, based on reading recipes online, sweet potato pone is basically sweet potato pie without the crust. So very similar. I do love good sweet potato pie. I love a good pumpkin pie. To me, they're somewhat interchangeable. I am going to cut this recipe in half because it is huge. It calls for 4 sweet potatoes and a cup of molasses and a cup of brown sugar. And that is a very large sweet potato pone, and there's only 2 of us here and we don't need quite that much food. So I'm going to cut the recipe in half. The other thing I note about the recipe, the way these are written is just in paragraph form rather than listing out ingredients. And the ingredients do not mention butter, but then the directions mention creaming the butter and sugar together. So there's supposed to be some butter in here, but I don't actually know how much. Looking online and just Googling sweet potato pone recipes, it seems to be around 4 tablespoons, although I did find one for 1 cup. I'm not going to do that. And so because I'm cutting the recipe in half, I think I'm going to just do 2 tablespoons of butter and we'll see how it comes out. So other ingredients that are going to go in this besides the sweet potatoes, and it should be noted the sweet potatoes go in grated and raw, which is interesting. So they're not cooked beforehand. So not like a sweet potato pie in that sense. We're going to do some lemon zest, some orange zest, as I mentioned, molasses and brown sugar, a little bit of milk, and I have a little bit of leftover heavy whipping cream leftover from Thanksgiving in my fridge, and I normally drink 2% milk, so I'm going to do a little bit of the heavy whipping cream in there just to up the milk fat a little bit. And then other spices include cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. So we're going to just try out this recipe and see what we end up with. I will probably also put a pinch of salt in there just because that's just good practice for any kind of cooking. I don't have any idea what size pan to cook this in as well because it doesn't mention that. So I'm thinking probably around an 8x8. So we're just going to wing it and see what we come up with, and we'll also base a little bit off of recipes that are online for a sweet potato pone in terms of cooking temperature and approximate time and things like that. But kind of a fun experiment, and I'm hoping for something delicious for dessert tonight and maybe for breakfast tomorrow if it's not too sweet. We'll see. Let's get started. And I could have run this through the food processor in order to grate it, but in the interest of channeling my ancestors, I decided to do this work by hand. I won't make you watch the whole thing, but it took about 2.5 minutes. All right, because I'm cutting this recipe in half, I'm going to just use a scant half cup rather than a scant cup. Not quite sure what a scant means, but we'll just not quite fill it all the way to the top. And I warmed this up in the microwave and then sprayed this with a little bit of oil, which makes it much easier to get all of the molasses out. And then I need the same amount of brown sugar. That seems like a scant, eh? Stuck in there because of the molasses. To this I need 2 large eggs. Woo! That one kind of exploded. It was so ready to crack. And then I'm just gonna mix these eggs and molasses and brown sugar together until it's looking well mixed and kind of creamy. And with the eggs and dairy in this, it's basically a custard. That is also true, of course, of pumpkin pie and sweet potato pie. And the recipe just calls for rind of 1 lemon and a small bit of orange peel. This is a tool my grandma did not have. Love my rasp grater. Anybody else ever wonder where lemons were coming from in 1925 when you were in Bozeman, Montana? I'm guessing off the train, but lemons are a winter fruit and they don't store that well. And I always wonder when I see recipes for like lemonade and things like that, like it's not a summer fruit. And where the heck were people getting lemons to make lemonade in the summertime in the old times when we didn't have the refrigeration and the food grade wax and things like that we have now? I've always wondered about that. But that is partly why oranges were something you would find in your Christmas stocking, because it wasn't something that you got a lot of and it was a winter fruit. So a lot of people don't realize that citrus in general is a winter fruit, not a summer fruit. So there's our lemon. And then I actually have a sweet potato pie that calls for orange rind, and it's delicious. So I'm probably going to do about the equivalent surface area of the orange that I did of the lemon, because I know that orange and sweet potatoes are delicious together. And if this recipe, I'm cutting it in half and it called for a lemon, so I've technically put more in here than the original recipe called for, but I'm also going to assume that they were being somewhat stingy with their citrus just because it wasn't something they had a lot of. So I'm going to put a little more in there than probably what it was called for. So again, most recipes I could find called for 4 tablespoons of butter. And since I'm cutting the recipe in half, I'm going to do 2 tablespoons. And I am going to melt that and just stir it into my sugar egg mixture. Eggs are an emulsifier, and that's why you always see butter stirred into eggs, because the egg yolks will make the butter stay mixed. And if you chunk your butter up into smaller pieces, it's less likely to explode all over your microwave. And that is something that took me a ridiculously long time to figure out. I still cover it, but less explosions. There's our butter almost melted. And I'm just gonna give that a little bit of a swirl and let that sit for a second, and that'll finish. Notice this is clean, things did not explode. It's an easy recipe to remember. It's a cup of everything, so in my case, it's a half a cup of everything. Or a scant half cup. Original recipe calls for a half a teaspoon each of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, so we're gonna do a 1/4 teaspoon each. And I'm not doing this in the exact order that it mentions, but I really don't think it's gonna matter. It called for doing butter and eggs together and then adding sugar. I can't remember. Either that or the other way around. Usually it's butter, sugar, then eggs, and I think this was opposite of that. All right, so 1/4 teaspoon each, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon. And again, that doesn't seem like a lot for this. And I'm guessing that's partially because spices would have been rather dear and expensive, and so probably not something you would do a ton of. And I have this 9-inch stoneware pan. I think I'm gonna try using this. I also have an 8-inch, but just in case it's a little big, this should give us enough room. And interestingly, I have an old Fanny Farmer cookbook, and I have an old Joy of Cooking cookbook. And I always look in there for old recipes like this, just to see and compare. and neither one of them have a pone recipe, so that's interesting. It's supposedly more of a southern thing, and so, especially sweet potato, because those were not grown in the north. It wasn't warm enough, so my guess is if I had an old southern cookbook, I might find a recipe for pone in it. Hopefully you can see why I was kind of intrigued by this. It's a nice mix. And I like the idea of this being raw. That's an interesting twist. And it just called for 4 large sweet potatoes. I have no idea what would constitute a large sweet potato in 1925. So I just kind of went with what looked to be an average sized sweet potato at the grocery store. It would be really interesting to do a corn recipe of this as well. I'm now really curious about pones in general, and a corn pone as opposed to a sweet potato pone. All right, that doesn't look too bad. We'll see what we got. Yeah, I could have done an 8-inch. And I'm assuming this is just gonna bubble up and do its custardy thing through the sweet potato, which is gonna be cooking at the same time. Well, this is gonna be quite interesting to see what we end up with here. Trying to make sure my sweet potato is even, because this batter is quite liquid. That is just a big piece of brown sugar that we're just gonna let cook in there and be delicious. All right, right now I have this oven at 350. I don't know if that's a good spot for it, but I'm gonna check some recipes online and I'll adjust it if I need to. And this is ready to go in the oven. And it says cook slowly for about an hour. So there she is. We'll see what we get. All right, you guys, it's been about an hour. Interesting. That looks pretty good. I'm gonna give it 5 more minutes just because I have no idea what it's supposed to look like. All right, we're gonna call this done. It's not jiggly. The one thing about these stoneware pans is they will take a little longer to cook because they insulate things so well, but that's been in there an hour. And pretty much almost every recipe that I looked at that was approximately this size, the cook time was about an hour. So I'm gonna let this cool for about 10 minutes and then we'll dig into it and see how it is for dessert. Let's see how our sweet potato pone is. This is basically a pudding, although I think it's going to be, it says that when it's cold, you should be able to serve it by the slice, so I think I can get it out of here. Oh yeah, no problem. I can smell the orange in that, which is lovely. And then I have a little bit, this is the rest of that whipped cream, which didn't whip very well, but it gave me something. And I think just because I have them, I'm going to add a few candied hazelnuts. So there you go, guys, sweet potato pone. As I wrap this up, I will do a voiceover and let you know what I thought of it. But an interesting, very old Southern recipe. I have no idea why there is a Southern recipe for sweet potato pone in a 1925 Bozeman, Montana women's cookbook. That's interesting in and of itself, but there you have it, and I imagine it's going to be quite delicious. So the flavor on this is excellent.
It's a little bit too sweet for me. I love the citrus that's in it. And the texture of the once raw sweet potato takes a little bit getting used to because it's not nice and soft the way it would be if it was pureed ahead of time, but not bad at all. So yeah, an interesting recipe. I don't know if I would make it again. I would probably just make a regular sweet potato pie, but definitely fun to experiment with and, give it a try, tribe, and see what you think. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.